Здравствуйте, Davidish. Na trenje neue televisne SSSR. We have breaking news coming in from the city of Pripyat as an explosion has occurred at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. But before we dive into seeing this accident, we must first see how the RBMK reactor works, then we can see the accident, and finally the cleanup process. Every nuclear reactor in the world works off the same thing, nuclear fusion, or fission. Now, I know what you might be thinking. What is fission? Fission is where you take an unstable element, like uranium-235, and use it as fuel. The neutrons from this fission will collide with each other and therefore create an immense amount of heat. And the RBMK reactor is quite simple with how it works, in fact. It takes the nuclear fission found in the core, and it uses water pumps on either side, here and here, pumps water into the core, and the heat from the fission heats up the water into steam, which will then go into a turbine. The turbine spins and creates electricity. During this process, there is an element called xenon that is created. If there's too much xenon during the process, then the reactor stalls, it dies, it's poisoned. However, when it is created, it is too hot in the reactor for it to build up, so it is immediately burned away. This is one flaw that is in with this reactor. Then we move on to the control rods. These control rods are found at the top of the core here. The control rods moderate the core and act as like brakes on a car. Yeah. Now, the final part is that the final moderation of this is not only the control rods, but also the water. As it is pumped into the cool, it is cool water. It cools the reactor down as well as turning into steam. That is, however, one of three major flaws. As said, the water. Number two major flaw, the control rods. They may think it's a moderator, it's going to help with it. No. They are made of boron, which will decrease radioactivity. However, they are graphite tipped, and graphite increases radioactivity exponentially. That will play a major part in the disaster yet to come. And the third flaw is lesser, but is still a big problem. There is no containment shed around this. The containment shed acts as a shield, so if the reactor has a leak, that it will not spill out into the outside area. Now, the incident had begun with, of all things, ironically, a safety test. The safety test was to demonstrate or to simulate blackout conditions, and these blackout conditions were either a foreign attack, a natural disaster, or even if the power plant loses power. Now, how they simulate this is that they put the wattage of the power plant down to 700 megawatts. That is to start with it. They use this they continue to pump water into this, which will then still create not as much steam, but some steam, which will still turn the generator. However, there's not as much electricity being made, so they take the dying electricity, or the dying turbine, that electricity, and they fuel the pumps for as long as they can until backup generators kick on. Now, the test was supposed to happen on April 25th. However, power grid controllers in Kiev had ordered it to wait 10 hours. Plant director Viktor Byrkanov, chief engineer Nikolai Fomin, as well as deputy chief engineer Anatoly Dyatlov had agreed that it would wait the 10 hours and be done by the night shift. And the problem with the night shift is that they are very much so more underqualified than the day shift. Take Leonid Tatanov, for example. He had started working at Chernobyl, reactor number 4, in 1983, 3 years prior to the incident. However, 2 months prior to the incident, he was promoted to a lead person in the control room. He and Alexander Akimov, two main people in the control room, as well as Anatoly Dyatlov. During the test, the buildup of xenon had poisoned the reactor. It stalled it. So what happened is that as it stalled, the wattage dropped to 30 megawatts, which is not enough to burn away the xenon, not enough to make steam, and so no electricity. During this, they had pulled out control rods in hope to increase their radioactivity. They had pulled out 205 of the 211 control rods of this reactor. There is no longer any brakes on this. In the moment they pull out the 205th control rod, the reactivity increases exponentially. It skyrockets. So in this moment, that Leonid Toptanov presses the scram button, or AZ5. In every nuclear reactor, there is a scram button, and the main purpose of this button is to completely shut down the reactor. It inserts every control rod into the reactor to stop the reactor. It turns it completely off. The problem, as said, the major flaw is that the control rods are graphite tipped, which increases radioactivity. So now we have arrived at 123.45 explosion. As soon as the button is pressed, every control rod, all 205 control rods insert into the reactor. The first thing to go into the reactor is the graphite tips. From this, the fission accelerates so much and the heat is so immense that every bit of xenon is burned away, as well as every molecule of liquid water is completely turned to steam in less than a second. This increase of steam causes the 1-ton reactor lid to pop off. In that moment, oxygen rushes in and combines with heated hydrogen and superheated graphite, which will then cause a second explosion, which would blow a massive hole in the roof of the building and scatter debris out in the grounds where firefighters would be combating fires. Speaking of firefighters, the initial 28 that the first 28, would die 3 months later. In the initial 14, there is a firefighter by the name of Vasily Ignatenko. He was fighting the fires on top of the reactor building, in the roof, next to the open core. He and fellow firefighters Tashura, Titnuk, Vashchuk, Kibnuk, and Pravchuk would later be hospitalized as they were climbing down, as they would vomit uncontrollably, as well as they were unable to fully support themselves. The day later, the fire is completely gone. Next is the fire in the reactor, which is still burning completely. Valery Alexandrov would propose an idea to dump boron and sand, a mixture of boron and sand, as well as other things like clay, onto the reactor to smother it. However, this would create its own problem, as it would mix to create a lava-like substance. This lava, this still is one of the deadliest things on planet Earth. This lava had threatened to melt through the concrete pad under the reactor and hit water tanks. If those water tanks had been hit by this, it would cause a thermonuclear reaction that would make the entirety of Belarus and Ukraine uninhabitable. Luckily, 3 volunteers, Anenko, Bespalov, and Baranov, would go in underneath the reactor into the radioactive water to shut off these valves and drain the water from the reactor. Among the firefighters, there was workers after the fact called liquidators, that would go into the radioactive area, clear out rubble from the roofs, from the grounds outside. Inside the exclusion zone, they would kill all radioactive animals and destroy all crops. Now, as we wrap up this expedition to Chernobyl, we have covered how the RBMK reactor works, the incident itself, as well as the people involved, as well as the cleanup process that has been taken, including the firefighters' heroic sacrifices. Now, as we wrap up, Chernobyl still stands to be an important subject of today. In fact, 2018, this containment lid was finally placed on top of it. And much more recent, scientists have found wolves in the exclusion zone that have mutated to have anti-cancerous genes. And до свидания, Davidish. Yeah.